you want to, you can be making your way in your Bibles over to 1 Kings chapter 5. We're going to study 1 Kings chapters 5 and 6 tonight. And we're going to read about or study about Solomon making preparations to build the temple and then the actual building of the temple itself. As with some of these sections of Scripture, of course, there's no way that we can read all these verses in here and I think get very much out of it if we do. So some of these we're going to paraphrase or we'll skip around, just read some of the highlights of them where we can get the general gist of what's going on. And then we'll talk a little bit about it as time allows us to do that. Question number one actually is kind of a thought question to start with and has to do with, of course, like we said, Solomon preparing to build the temple and then the building of the temple itself. But if you look on your sheet, number one is a question, what are some things that are essential to a successful building project? And I know probably most, I'd say probably all of us have been involved in some kind of building project over the years. And some of them are major, some of them are minor. But what are some of the characteristics to a successful building project? Okay, you got to have the material.
You got to have somebody knowledgeable enough to know how to put it together.
Okay, you got to have somebody who knows what they're doing, right? Or it's not going to turn out successful.
You got to have the motivation to get started.
Okay, motivation to start it and finish it, right? Money, yeah, money is an essential, isn't it? Anything else come to mind? Patience, yeah, especially if you're dealing with a big project, right? You know, I was thinking about what Jesus said over in Luke chapter 14, and beginning there in verse 28, but remember he was actually teaching a different principle, but using this illustration. He's talking about counting the cost of being one of his disciples. But in verse 28 he said, "For which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he has sufficient to finish it? Lest haply after he hath laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first and counseleth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an embassage and desireth conditions of peace." You know, those two things, counsel and money. You know, Jesus talked about, what a fool, what kind of fool would sit down and or start building a tower or building project and not sit down and think, well, do I have enough money to do this to start with? And then get halfway through it or just, pour the foundation for it and he has to stop because he can't finish. Or what person making war wouldn't sit down and kick around the idea, can I defeat a greater army than what I have? Can my soldiers defeat an army that's twice their size? That's has to do with the idea again of counting the cost, and Jesus using it in that context about being a disciple of Christ. But if you think about it, really the bottom line is preparation, right? Takes some preparing some things beforehand if you're going to have a successful building project. Like we said, that could be money, knowledge, all those things come into play. And so what we're reading about in chapter 5 here is some of the preparations that Solomon is making to ensure that building God's temple is going to be a successful project. Let's read a little bit about an alliance between Solomon and another king by the name of Hiram. If I can, somebody read for us a pretty lengthy passage here, but the first 12 verses of 1 Kings 5.
And Hiram the king of Tyre sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father, for Hiram was ever a lover of David. And Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, Thou knowest how that David my father could not build a house unto the name of the Lord his God for the wars which were about him on every side unto
Okay, the first thing we read about in verse 1 here of chapter 5 is that whenever Hiram, who is king of Tyre, hears that Solomon, David's son, is appointed as king, immediately sends these envoy of servants down to greet Solomon. And so, number 2, the question is, why did the king of Tyre do that? Why did he send that envoy of servants?
He loved David.
Yeah, it was really because of Solomon's father, wasn't it? It wasn't necessarily because of Solomon himself, but the Bible says that he was a lover of David. He and David, David himself conducted a few building projects, and certainly Hiram had a hand in some of those projects. In fact, look back in 2 Samuel chapter 5 with me here real quickly. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 11, it says, "And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons, and they built David an house." So whenever David built his house, Hiram was kind of the provider of the materials, and not only that, but the workmen themselves. And so, why do you think he would send servants to Solomon?
See what he could do for him, maybe?
Okay, obviously, as we read there, Hiram and David were pretty close. So, do you think Hiram would have known about David's desire to build God's temple? Yeah, I think he probably would have. And he probably would have known that Solomon was the one who was going to do that. And so basically he sends these servants, I think, as kind of a courtesy to offer his services, to help be of assistance to him. And again, it was based upon not necessarily his and Solomon's relationship, but because of his father. And so the second part of question number 2 is, why would a person's friends be favorably disposed toward his or her children? Okay, might have a little bit of knowledge and interaction with them, right? What else?
See your friend.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an extension of your friend, isn't it? When you're talking about their children. And so I think it's only natural to care about them, to deal with them in a favorable way if you had a good relationship with your friend before that. And so you see that with Solomon and with Hiram here. Question number 3 is, why is it ideal to begin a big project only when other areas of your life are reasonably stable? And the reason that I bring that up, if you look back in verse 3, we talked about, let me get out of 2 Samuel here. If you look back in 1 Kings chapter 5, Solomon said, "Thou knowest how that David my father could not build an house under the name of the Lord his God, for the wars which were about him on every side, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet." So, what was Solomon saying there?
He's been too distracted. Did a proper job.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting concept because, we read before, God told David, "You're a bloody man," or "You're a man of war, and so you can't build this temple or this house for me." It's interesting that Solomon adds a little bit of detail to that and talks about the fact that David was constantly fighting. I mean, we studied it before Solomon. I mean, it seemed like he just went from conflict after conflict after conflict. And so, would it have been a good idea for David to have built God's house? Why not? Yeah, he couldn't have put all of his time and all of his energy into it, right? Because his attention would have been divided with all these wars and all these different conflicts that were going on. And so basically, Solomon is saying that his father couldn't build that house because he was too preoccupied with warfare. And again, when you study the life of David, that of course is certainly manifest in it. Notice in verse 4, though, what he says about his reign. He says, "But now the Lord my God hath given me rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurring." You know, we talked about last week, one of the greatest blessings that the nation is going to enjoy under Solomon is a time of peace, a time of rest. And so, since Solomon didn't have all these wars going on, what would that have allowed him to do? Yeah, focused, right? He could have poured all of his energy and all of his time and all of his focus into building this house for God. And so, you know, that's true with our lives too, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to start a big building project, you need to be distracted over here. You need to be able to devote some time and some attention and some detail to it, don't you? And if you don't do that, it could end up going wrong. And so that's just kind of a common sense thing there. Question number 4. Does it make more sense to call upon recognized experts, and we're talking about whenever you're building something, or to try to do everything yourself? Notice in verse 6 what Solomon says to Hiram, king of Tyre. He says, "Now therefore command thou that they hew me cedar trees out of Lebanon, and my servants shall be with thy servants, and unto thee will I give hire for thy servants, according to all that thou shalt appoint. For thou knowest that there is not among us any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians." So, what were the Sidonians? What kind of label would you put on them? Yeah, they were expert craftsmen, wasn't there? They were the top of the line when it came to that day and age. So why do you think Solomon wanted them to help?
Get it right.
Yeah, why didn't he just, make all Israelites take care of building this temple of God?
The whole point was he wanted to be the best.
Yeah. So if it's going to be the best, you got to use the best, right? You got to use these experts. And when we think about the idea of building, is it better to use experts than to try to do it yourself?
If money is not enough.
Yeah. That's kind of what popped into my head too. There is a downside to that, right? And that is expense. Did Solomon have to worry about money though? No, he didn't have any. He didn't have any problem with money, and so he hired the best. He paid the best, and that's what he told Hiram. He said, "I'll pay whatever their wages are. I'll take care of them." And certainly, he wanted this temple to be again the most magnificent structure in Israel, and he wanted all nations to recognize it and talk about it.
I got on the feeling anybody that had given Solomon, he was a good man. And like Hiram, it made Hiram rich to build all, he built the house of David, he built the temple, he built it all out. Solomon, it was like making him rich doing it.
Yeah, and in fact, we read about what was the actual compensation. Do you remember? Yeah, if you go down to verse 11, it says, "Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 measures of wheat for food to his household, and 20 measures of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year." So this was kind of the agreement that they came up with. We did some math last week. Does anybody remember the idea of the measure?
Was it 100 or 1,000?
Yeah, that's a good question. What was it? Yeah, it was 100. So if you take 100 and multiply that by 20,000, what do you get? Somebody's good at math, tell me that. 200,000? So it'd feed about 200,000 people, just the wheat. I read somewhere, I don't remember, I was going to write it down, but I read somewhere the oil, of course, that'd kind of be hard to feed yourself with oil, but where was it I read that? It was over 100,000 gallons that the oil equated to. Oil was very precious in that day, of course. Used it to cook, used it for medicinal purposes. There are a lot of different uses for it. So it is true. I mean, Hiram did profit physically from this. It was a business transaction, wasn't it? Even though it was done among friends. But Solomon wanted the experts to do it because, again, that was his whole point in doing this, was to do the very best and to get the very best in everything that was done for this building of God. Anybody have any thoughts or comments before we move on?
I wonder if that was just put in the taxes for the 12. They had to do it monthly for him.
The 12 governors, you mean? Yeah.
I bet it did.
Yeah, that could be. All right, somebody read for us back here in 1 Kings 5. Read for us verses 13 through 18.
King Solomon raised up the labor force out of all Israel. The labor force was 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 monthly shifts, and 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months in Home. And Joram was in charge of the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, and 80,000 poured stone mountain, besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised people who labored in the work. The king commanded him to quarry large stones, costly stones, and huge stones, to lay the foundation of the temple. So Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gibeonites quarried them, and they prepared timbers and stones to build the temple.
Okay, so again, we're getting a picture here of, just how massive of a project this was. We talked about how Solomon needed to focus, and pour his time and his attention and all this money into the building of this project. But when you talk about the labor force, the number of men that were employed, in constructing this temple, it's certainly, it's almost mind-boggling to me to think about that many people. Question number 5 is how many workers of different sorts, we read about several of them there, did Solomon have to work on the temple? What was the first number we started out with there?
30.
Okay, 30,000. And what was their job?
Rotating into Lebanon.
Yeah, basically 10,000 men every month would go up to Lebanon and help with these cedars and getting them down to Israel. And so by the end of 3 months, all 30,000 men would have had a 1 month rotation in this. And the other 2 months, it says they stayed at home, and what that means is they stayed back home and worked at the temple. So for 2 months, they were working at the temple. For 1 month, they would go up to Lebanon and work up there. And so you had 30,000 men who were just employed in that area itself. What's the next number we read about there? How many?
70,
Yeah, I think so. 70,000. What was their job? Yeah, basically I think it was transporting materials. That was kind of what they were hired to do. 70,000 men to transport all these materials, back and forth for the construction of the temple. And then what's the next number?
80,000.
80,000. What was their job?
Hewers in the mountains.
Yeah, they were working in the rock quarries. Their job was cutting out these massive stones and getting them ready to fit into the building of this magnificent temple. And then the last number that we read about is what? Yeah, how many supervisors did he have? 3,300 supervisors. Can you imagine that? I did the ratio was about 1 supervisor to every 35 workers. So, there was just a massive amount of people, that were employed and involved in the construction of this building. And kind of jumping forward here a little bit, but I think it's a good point to bring it up. How long did it take all these workers to build the temple? Yeah, 7 years. 7 years. Even though you had this tremendous labor force, still took them 7 years to build this temple and to complete everything.
150,000 people worked 7 years. I think it's 90 by 45, 3 stories tall, 90 foot long. It wasn't that big.
No.
So it must have been something.
Yeah, and you read about it, the craftsmanship of it, I think, was what was so impressive. I can understand the moving of the stones. Cutting stones out of mountains and, moving them by hand in that day and age, that would have been a massive undertaking in and of itself. But yeah, there were a lot of other details that went into the construction of this temple, and it wasn't the size that was so amazing about it, but the craftsmanship of it was just unparalleled. Anybody else? All right, so here's a thought, number 6. We read about this tremendous number of people who are working on this project, what made it possible for all these people to work so well together? We're not even just talking about just Israelites, we're talking about foreigners too, right? So what made it work? Yeah, I think you start with good oversight, right? You had 3,300 supervisors, and evidently they were good ones, because there's no way that you could coordinate that number of people, to work together and to get along without good leadership. What else would you say was key in it?
Purpose.
Yeah, they were united in purpose, right? They weren't divided in mind. They were all working together toward one common goal. What else?
They were treated well.
Okay, so that made them want to work, maybe?
Being fed, having time off.
Yeah. Yeah, they weren't overworked, were they? I mean, they worked, no doubt about it.
Maybe even had a union.
Some sorts, huh? Yeah. What else? So the treatment of the employees?
God himself.
Okay.
It says, bless the Lord, build the house, its workers labor in vain.
Yeah, so certainly the hand of God was at work in it. I think there's a lot of things when you think about a great task being accomplished that we could consider. Mentioned oversight. I had down here attitude. Good work ethic. Can't have people who are going to be goofing off. If you're going to get anything accomplished. But when they went to work, they went to work. A lot of humility. I mean, you think about having to work. The people having to subject themselves to other people. I mean, there has to be humility present there in order for that to accomplish. But when you think about what they did, that's really a picture of what God wants in the church today, isn't it? I mean, how are we going to accomplish a great task? Well, it's not by fighting with each other. It's not by being divided. It's not without good leadership. It's not going to happen without that. It's not without a humility of mind. It's not without a good attitude. It's not without a good work ethic. So, a lot of good lessons, I think, in studying this. And it's amazing how these people were able to come together, such a great number of people, to accomplish a magnificent thing. So let's go. We're going to go over to chapter 6, and we're not going to read much of this chapter, but we are going to read just some of these excerpts from it and talk a little bit about it. Basically, the first 14 verses of chapter 6 deal with the construction of the exterior of the temple. And chapter 6 actually begins with a chronological note in verse 1. It says, "It came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come up out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So we're given a timeline, and we're given a way to account for time in two different ways. What are they? What's the first one?
Time away from Egypt.
Yeah, the time from the children of Israel came up out of Egypt, and the second one is what? 4th year of Solomon's reign. Now, I kind of mentioned last week, we read these chapters, and sometimes I think we think they're just happening boom, 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 back to back to back. But this is 4 years into the reign of Solomon that we're reading about before the actual construction of the temple starts in chapter 6 here. And so when you read down through it, look at verse 7. Somebody read verse 7 for us in 1 Kings 6.
And the house, when it was in building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building.
Okay, what was so unusual about the building activity on the actual temple site that would be different from other building sites?
Got the stones to fit.
Yeah, there were no tools of iron that were used on the building site in the construction of the temple. What do you think of when you think of iron tools? Noise, right? Yeah, a lot of pounding, a lot of noise going on here. And so every stone before it came to the temple had already been cut to the exact dimensions, so that when it got there, there wasn't a piece of iron that you had to put on anything to put it together. Now, do you think that took a little bit of craftsmanship to do that? I mean, from time to time I build things, but I always have a saw right beside me and a pencil and a tape measure, and usually I have to cut 2-3 different times, in case you mess something up. But these things were, probably cut and checked and double checked and triple checked to make sure that everything was going to fit into place. What do you think would have been the significance of that? Why would they have done it that way? Any idea? Any guess? Really, the Bible doesn't say.
I was thinking maybe it'd make it go together easier, since there was time of peace and no war, and it'd also make your crews have better days and less fighting during the building, or
Okay.
scratching your head about something maybe.
So making the assembly process a little bit easier?
Sure.
Yeah. Somebody else say something?
Respect of God.
Yeah. Yeah, this was a sacred place in the minds of the Israelites, and I think part of it was, again, out of great respect that Solomon had for God. We read a couple of weeks ago about the tremendous number of animals that he sacrificed to God. He was a true worshiper of God, and so had a lot of respect for him. Some people think, a lot of these things we read about in the Old Testament are types of something greater to come, and some commentators have suggested, that's how God wants it in His house. He wants it to be a peaceful atmosphere, no fighting, no division, a bunch of noise going on, but for everybody to be at peace. Some people have suggested, that's a picture of the church, that men are made perfect and whole by the blood of Christ before they're added to the Lord's church, before they're added to the temple of God. So maybe that's the case, but at any rate, it was not only a truly magnificent in the craftsmanship itself, but in how it was constructed, and the fact that everything was cut beforehand, and then it was brought to one place, and it was all assembled together. Question number 8 here. Somebody read verses 11 through 13 for us here in chapter 6.
And the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which thou art building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes and execute my judgments, and keep all my commandments to walk in them, then will I perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David thy father. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel.
Okay, so question 8 is, what word did Solomon receive from God concerning the temple? We just read it there in those verses.
Keep it standing.
Yeah, what were the conditions for God's presence in the temple and His fulfilling of the promises that He made to David? Yeah, it was obedience, wasn't it? So basically what God is telling Solomon is, just don't think just because you built this building I'm going to be here, okay? If you want me to be with you and you want me to fulfill the promises that I made to your father, you've got to obey my word. You've got to do what I said. And so the temple alone, was not sufficient for Solomon to receive these blessings from God. He poured a lot of time, a lot of money, did a great work for God, but obedience was also necessary. And that building that temple meant nothing. In the end, when Solomon stood before God, the building of that temple would mean nothing without him being obedient to God. It would have no significance. And so that's really, I think, what God is stressing here to Solomon and trying to relay in his mind. I think when I kind of think about it in our terms today, what's the significance of a church building?
The contents, people.
Yeah, is it anything without obedience? No. That's the thing that God is really trying to get, right? And that's not to say church building is a bad thing. But you think back to the temple. Why did God allow men to build this house for him? Did God need this house? Was it essential to his living? Did it improve his living conditions? No. So why did God allow men to do this?
For man.
Yeah, it was for man's benefit, wasn't it? It wasn't necessarily for God. And I think when you think about a church building today, that's kind of the same significance, isn't it? I mean, it's not that God needs this building, but it's for man. It's for us to fulfill these commandments that God has given us and help better serve Him. And you know, the construction of the temple was unique in that there were some characteristics that help people better understand God. And so it was for the benefit of man. If you read in verses 15 through 28 of 1 Kings 6, you read about the construction of the interior of the temple. We're running out of time here, so we're not going to read anymore. But question 9 is, what was a unique characteristic of the inner sanctuary and all the articles that were found there? You can read that in verses 20 through 22 if you don't already know. Yeah, I wrote gold and more gold, right? Everything in there was overlaid with gold. Can you imagine walking into a room like that? The floor is gold, the walls are gold, ceiling. Every article in there is gold. And what did that reflect? Yeah, the best. I mean, this was the place, you know, where the Ark of the Covenant was, the inner sanctuary. This was the place where God met with man and communicated with man. And what did the most holy place represent? Heaven, right? That's what it was a type of. And so it's interesting, you know, you read about some of these things about the temple, but the emphasis that's really given to the temple is not all the outward things on it, but it's what was inside. You know, it's this detailed description of inside and the most holy place being symbolic of heaven. You know, the most glorious thing that we could probably imagine is a room of gold, but it symbolized God and His dwelling place.
I used to picture it as sheets of gold. But if I'm not mistaken, when I read, I think they intricately carved into all that, right? Before they overlaid it with gold.
Yeah.
So it was like, it wasn't just a sheet of gold, it was a sheet of decorated gold.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, it wasn't just flat and shiny.
yeah.
But there are all kinds of carvings. The cherubims are a lot of them that we read about. You know, in fact, there are two tremendous cherubims in the most holy place that you read about there. But everything in there was overlaid with gold. We asked, number 11, took 7 years to complete the temple. Question 12, kind of an interesting thought question here as we end. You ever had a building project or a task that you had to work on for more than a year? Anybody ever experienced that? What are some of the downfalls of that? Are there downfalls?
Yes.
Okay, what would some of the downfalls be?
Well, you keep wondering if you're going to have enough money.
Okay. What else?
Patience runs thin.
Yeah, you get worn out, don't you? You get tired of dealing with it. And you get run down, you get discouraged, you get weary. You ever get disinterested? Yeah, sometimes you just want a day where you can unplug from it and, you know, drift off and do something else. 7 years is a long time to build something. So there were plenty of opportunities, I think, for Solomon to get disinterested, to get discouraged, to get weary. But the lesson is he stuck with it, you know, and that's really the idea of the Christian life. Sometimes you get tired, don't you? Sometimes you get discouraged. Sometimes you just want to unplug and do something else for a little while. But you got to just keep going at it slowly. And it might take a long time, but in the end, is it going to be worth it? Yeah, I have an idea when Solomon looked at that temple, he thought, man, that's exactly what I thought it would be, and it was worth every ounce of sweat and every second that was poured into it. All right, anybody have any thoughts or questions before we end?